History is a collection of the world's greatest stories. The problem is, the best ones are almost always lies. We've replaced boring truths with heroic myths, convenient propaganda, and scandalous rumors because they're just more entertaining. Today, we're peeling back the curtain on 40 historical figures to reveal the often disappointing, sometimes shocking, and always fascinating reality behind the legends. 1. We've all heard of the Napoleon complex, that aggressive attitude supposedly adopted by short men to compensate for their lack of height. It's a pop psychology staple, named after history's most famously tiny tyrant. But what if the man who inspired the term wasn't actually short at all? The truth is, Napoleon stood at around 5 feet 7 inches, a perfectly respectable, even slightly above average height for his time. This entire global slander campaign was orchestrated by British propagandists who used cartoons to shrink him down to a laughable pipsqueak. The confusion was amplified by a measurement mix-up between French and English inches. So, one of history's greatest military minds has been posthumously diagnosed with a psychological complex based on nothing more than enemy trash talk and bad unit conversion. 2. Imagine the scene. Revolutionary France is starving, the people cry out for bread, and from her lavish palace, Queen Marie Antoinette utters the most cold-hearted line in history: "Let them eat cake." It's the perfect quote to fuel a revolution, encapsulating the obscene disconnect of the monarchy. It's so perfect, in fact, that it was completely made up. Historians can find zero credible evidence that she ever said this. The phrase actually appeared in the writings of philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau years before Marie even set foot in France, attributed to an unnamed great princess. It was essentially a pre-existing meme that revolutionary propagandists slapped onto her to make her the ultimate villain. She was framed by a soundbite. 3. Here's a comforting thought for anyone who's ever struggled in school. Albert Einstein, the genius who redefined physics, was a total dunce who failed mathematics. It's the ultimate underdog story, proof that a rough start doesn't doom you. Except this historical security blanket is a complete fabrication. Einstein was a certified prodigy who mastered advanced calculus in his early teens. The myth was born from a simple administrative change at his school, which reversed its grading system. So when historians looked back at his report card and saw the number 6, the new failing grade, they assumed he was flunking. In reality, he was acing everything. Sorry to burst that bubble, but your C in algebra doesn't put you in the same league as Einstein. He was just bored. 4. Cleopatra. The name itself conjures images of an impossibly beautiful Egyptian queen, a seductress so stunning, she brought Roman generals to their knees. Hollywood has cemented this image for decades, casting icons like Elizabeth Taylor to play her. But history paints a very different picture. First, she wasn't Egyptian. She was part of the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty. Second, contemporary accounts and coinage from her time suggest she was not a conventional beauty. Roman coins depict her with a hooked nose and a prominent chin. Her true power wasn't her looks, but her brilliant mind. She spoke multiple languages, was a cunning political strategist, and was reportedly so charming and witty in conversation that men were utterly captivated. Her allure was in her intellect, not her appearance, a far more impressive and threatening quality. 5. We all know the story. A young George Washington chops down his father's prized cherry tree. When confronted, he bravely proclaims, "I cannot tell a lie." It's the foundational myth of American integrity, taught to children to instill the value of honesty. The only problem is that the story about not telling a lie is, itself, a complete and total lie. It was entirely invented by an early biographer named Mason Locke Weems, a bookseller who figured a dash of heroic fiction would help move more copies of his Washington biography. So, the ultimate story of American truthfulness was fabricated as a marketing gimmick. It's like finding out the inventor of the "Honesty is the best policy" poster was a notorious con artist. 6. In a fit of madness, Vincent van Gogh cut off his entire ear. This is one of art history's most gruesome and famous legends, cementing Van Gogh's image as the ultimate tortured artist. It's a powerful story, but it's a dramatic exaggeration. The reality, while still deeply unsettling, is that Van Gogh only severed a portion of his left earlobe, not the entire ear. The incident happened after a heated argument with his fellow artist Paul Gauguin, and was a symptom of his severe mental health crisis. But over the years, the story has been embellished, transforming a tragic act of self-harm into a grand, mythical gesture. It's as if history decided that losing just a piece of an ear wasn't quite dramatic enough for a genius of his caliber. 7. There is perhaps no historical rumor more grotesquely slanderous than the one surrounding the death of Catherine the Great of Russia. For centuries, the story has circulated that she died in an unfortunate incident involving a horse. This vile piece of gossip was a masterclass in political character assassination. Her enemies, threatened by an immensely powerful and intelligent woman who expanded the Russian Empire, couldn't attack her achievements. So they concocted the most humiliating and dehumanizing lie they could imagine to tarnish her legacy. The truth is far more mundane. She suffered a stroke in her dressing room and died in her bed the next day. The horse story was just a desperate, misogynistic smear campaign that proved disturbingly effective. 8. Sir Isaac Newton discovered gravity after an apple fell from a tree and hit him on the head. This tale makes one of the most significant scientific breakthroughs in human history sound like an episode of a slapstick comedy. A simple bonk on the head, and voila, the laws of universal gravitation. The truth is far less cartoonish. While Newton did say that observing a falling apple in his garden prompted him to think about the forces governing motion, there was no head-hitting involved. The apple simply made him wonder why it fell straight down, rather than sideways or upwards, and whether that same force could extend all the way to the moon. It was the spark for years of intense mathematical labor, not a sudden revelation delivered by rogue fruit. Science is rarely that simple or that painful. 9. Let's talk about Walt Disney, the man who built a magical kingdom. According to one of the most persistent modern myths, his final wish was to be cryogenically frozen, his head preserved in a secret chamber beneath Disneyland, waiting for future technology to revive him. It's a ghoulishly fascinating tale that fits his futurist persona perfectly. But it's pure fantasy. In reality, Walt Disney's final arrangements were entirely conventional. He was cremated 2 days after his death in 1966. The whole frozen head story was likely a dark joke that spiraled out of control, possibly started by his own mischievous animators. So no, the king of the Magic Kingdom is not chilling out on ice, waiting for a comeback tour. 10. Every school kid learns the heroic tale. While the rest of 15th century Europe cowered in fear of sailing off the edge of a flat Earth, the brave Christopher Columbus set sail to prove it was round. It's a story of a lone visionary against a world of fools. It's also 100% false. By Columbus's time, any educated person knew the Earth was a sphere. The concept had been established by the ancient Greeks over 1,000 years earlier. The actual debate wasn't about the Earth's shape, but its size. The experts correctly calculated the planet's circumference and knew Asia was too far to reach by sailing west. Columbus, using wildly inaccurate calculations, insisted the world was much smaller. He wasn't a visionary genius. He was a stubborn man who was terrible at math, got lucky, and accidentally bumped into a continent he never knew existed. 11. The city of Rome is a raging inferno, and on a nearby hill, Emperor Nero calmly plucks his fiddle, a cruel artist admiring his destructive masterpiece. It's the ultimate image of a sociopathic leader, indifferent to his people's suffering. There are just a couple of historical inconsistencies with this story. First, the fiddle wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. Second, and more importantly, historical records show Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. He rushed back to the city to organize and fund relief efforts, opening his own palaces to shelter the homeless. The myth was propaganda spread by his political rivals who wanted to paint him as a monster. He may have been a terrible musician and a deeply flawed ruler, but he wasn't the guy who played a concert during a catastrophe. 12. Grigory Rasputin, the mad monk, the mystic advisor to the Tsarina, and, according to legend, an almost unkillable demon. The story of his death is legendary. He was poisoned with enough cyanide to kill 5 men, shot multiple times, and finally drowned in a frozen river. It paints a picture of a supernatural being who refused to die. The truth is that Rasputin wasn't a mythical beast. He was just the victim of history's most inept hit squad. A group of panicked aristocrats botched the entire assassination. Modern analysis suggests the cyanide may have been ineffective due to poor preparation, and the official autopsy reported that the actual cause of death was a single, decisive gunshot to the head. He wasn't superhuman. His murderers were just catastrophically bad at their job. 13. Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, single-handedly illuminated the world by inventing the light bulb. This image of a lone genius toiling away until a bulb magically flickers to life is burned into our collective memory. But Edison didn't invent the light bulb. He just perfected it. Dozens of inventors had already created incandescent lights, some decades earlier. Edison's real genius was in figuring out how to make a long-lasting, affordable bulb and then building the entire power grid system to support it. He was less of a solitary inventor and more of a ruthless CEO who ran an invention factory and knew that the person who makes something practical and markets it well gets all the credit, while the true pioneers are forgotten. 14. The pirate Blackbeard. A demonic figure so terrifying he wove lit fuses into his beard to surround his face with smoke and fire. He was supposedly the most savage cutthroat to ever sail the seas, leaving a trail of carnage in his wake. In reality, Blackbeard was less of a monster and more of a master of branding and psychological warfare. He cultivated this terrifying image so that most ships would surrender without a fight, saving him the trouble and risk of actual combat. His record shows he killed very few people and often treated his captives relatively well. He was essentially an 18th century performance artist who discovered that having a reputation for being a psychopath was far more efficient than actually being one. 15. The story of Pocahontas and John Smith is a tale of forbidden love, where a brave Native American princess saves an English explorer and bridges the gap between two worlds. It's a narrative that Disney turned into a global phenomenon. The historical reality, however, was less of a romance and more of a deeply unsettling hostage situation. When the famous incident where she supposedly saved his life occurred, Pocahontas was a child, somewhere between 10 and 12 years old, and John Smith was a grown man of 27. Most historians believe the execution was either a misunderstood adoption ritual or a dramatic tale Smith invented years later to sell books. She was later captured, held for ransom by the English, and married off to another colonist. The story isn't about love, it's about propaganda. 16. Winston Churchill is celebrated as one of history's greatest wits, a man whose sharp, spontaneous insults could disarm any opponent. The most famous example involves him and a female MP. "Winston, you are drunk," she says. He supposedly retorts, "And you, madam, are ugly. But in the morning, I shall be sober." An absolutely legendary comeback. But the idea that these brilliant lines were all off the cuff is a stretch. Churchill was a meticulous writer who often prepared his spontaneous zingers in advance, storing them in his notes to be deployed at the perfect moment. He was less of an improvisational genius and more of a political comedian who rehearsed his material, understanding that a well-timed, pre-planned insult could be as powerful as any policy. 17. Antonio Salieri, the jealous, mediocre court composer who, consumed by envy for a divinely gifted Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, ultimately poisons him. This narrative, immortalized in the film Amadeus, is a masterpiece of dramatic fiction. The only problem is that history refuses to cooperate. In reality, Salieri was a highly respected and successful composer in his own right, and while he and Mozart were professional rivals, there's ample evidence of mutual respect. They even collaborated on a cantata. The poisoning story was a rumor that took off long after Mozart's death, from what was likely a severe illness. Salieri's legacy was essentially hijacked and ruined by a playwright and a filmmaker who knew a great story is more profitable than the boring truth. 18. That iconic image of Che Guevara, the defiant stare, the beret, the revolutionary cool, has become a global symbol of rebellion and fighting for the oppressed. It's on posters, t-shirts, and coffee mugs worldwide. This romanticized image, however, conveniently ignores the man behind the brand. After the Cuban Revolution, Che the rebel became Che the state functionary. He was put in charge of the La Cabaña fortress prison, where he oversaw the trials and executions of hundreds of political prisoners. He was a key architect of Cuba's labor camp system. The symbol on the t-shirt represents a fight against oppression, while the man himself became a ruthless enforcer for an authoritarian state. 19. Ferdinand Magellan is celebrated in every history book as the first person to circumnavigate the globe. A heroic feat of exploration that proved beyond all doubt the world was round. There's just a slight technicality that gets glossed over. Magellan never actually finished the trip. In fact, he didn't even make it halfway. He was killed in the Philippines after getting involved in a local tribal dispute he had absolutely no business being in. The real credit for completing the first circumnavigation belongs to the 18 surviving members of his original crew and their new captain, Juan Sebastian Elcano. But Magellan had better branding and a more memorable name, so he gets the headline, while the guys who actually survived the entire grueling journey are relegated to a historical footnote. 20. When you think of King Henry VIII, you picture a bloated, gluttonous tyrant perpetually chewing on a turkey leg. He's become the historical poster child for angry obesity. But this image only captures the disastrous final act of his life. In his youth, Henry was the total package: tall, athletic, handsome, and considered one of the most charismatic princes in Europe. He was a celebrated jouster and sportsman. The dramatic transformation began after a severe jousting accident left him with a festering leg wound that refused to heal. The constant, agonizing pain and his inability to exercise led to his massive weight gain and infamous temper. One bad fall essentially turned a Renaissance idol into a paranoid monster. 21. Picture Benjamin Franklin, America's favorite polymath, flying a kite in a raging thunderstorm with a metal key attached. It's a moment of near-suicidal genius, the birth of our understanding of electricity. This story is true, but the version we imagine is lethally stupid. Franklin was a brilliant scientist, not an idiot. He knew a direct lightning strike would have instantly vaporized him. He didn't wait for the kite to be struck. He used the wet string to conduct ambient electrical charge from the storm clouds down to the key, proving that lightning was electrical in nature. He stayed under cover, away from the main event. It was a calculated, controlled experiment, not a daredevil stunt with God. 22. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Thanks to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's famous poem, we picture Paul Revere as the lone, heroic rider who single-handedly warned the colonists that the British were coming. This is a fantastic piece of storytelling, but terrible history. Revere was just one part of a complex warning system involving dozens of riders. Not only was he not alone, but he was captured by a British patrol before he could even complete his mission. The rider who actually got through to Concord, carrying the most crucial part of the warning, was a doctor named Samuel Prescott. But the midnight ride of Dr. Prescott just doesn't have the same ring to it, so a poet erased a team effort to create one tidy, rhyming hero. 23. After being forced by the Inquisition to recant his heretical view that the Earth revolves around the Sun, Galileo Galilei supposedly muttered under his breath, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. It's the ultimate act of intellectual defiance, a final stand for science against dogma. It's a shame it never happened. The phrase appears nowhere in the trial records and was first attributed to him over a century later by a biographer. The reality was far less heroic. Facing the very real threat of being tortured to death, an elderly Galileo did what any sane person would do. He publicly renounced his work to save his own skin. The defiant whisper was just wishful thinking, invented to give a grim story a more satisfying Hollywood-style ending. 24. William Shakespeare. Was he a barely literate glovemaker's son from the countryside, or a front for a secret committee of aristocratic geniuses? For centuries, people have insisted that a commoner couldn't possibly have written such masterpieces. This snobbery has spawned countless conspiracy theories. The truth is, there is an enormous amount of historical evidence that a real man named William Shakespeare wrote the plays. But the lie isn't just that he was a fraud. It's the modern idea that he was a solitary genius who locked himself in a room and channeled the divine. In reality, Elizabethan theater was a highly collaborative, cutthroat business. He was a working playwright, an actor, and a shareholder who borrowed plots, worked with other writers, and revised scripts to please the crowd. He was less of a tormented artist and more of a brilliant, hard-working entertainment producer. 25. Henry Ford didn't just put America on wheels. He invented both the automobile and the revolutionary assembly line to build it. It's a classic tale of singular American innovation. Except he did neither. The first successful gasoline-powered automobile was built by Carl Benz in Germany, years before Ford's Model T. And the concept of an assembly line was already being used by other industrialists like Ransom E. Olds. Ford's true genius wasn't in invention, but in ruthless optimization. He perfected the moving assembly line to a terrifying degree of efficiency, making cars affordable for the masses. He wasn't the inventor. He was the world's most effective and richest process improvement manager. 26. The foundational quote of Western philosophy, delivered by Socrates. "The only thing I know is that I know nothing." This line has been adopted as the mantra of the humbly wise and the excuse of the willfully ignorant. But it's a profound misinterpretation. Socrates wasn't proclaiming he was an empty-headed fool. His point was a far more subtle jab at the arrogant elites of Athens. He was saying that while others were certain of their knowledge, he was the only one wise enough to recognize the vast limits of his own understanding. It was an expression of intellectual humility, not a confession of stupidity. It's the difference between saying, "I don't know anything," and "I understand the boundary between what I know and what I don't." 27. Genghis Khan. The name itself evokes images of a savage barbarian leading a mindless horde across the plains, leaving nothing but destruction in his wake. While the Mongol conquests were undeniably brutal on a scale that is hard to comprehend, painting him as a simple brute is wildly inaccurate. Khan was also a visionary administrator. He created one of the first international postal systems, established universal laws known as the Yasa, promoted trade along the Silk Road, and practiced religious tolerance in his empire long before it was fashionable in Europe. He was less a simple barbarian and more a terrifyingly effective nation-builder with the most aggressive expansion policy in human history. 28. Sir Walter Raleigh, the dashing English courtier, is famous for two things: popularizing tobacco in England and chivalrously laying his cloak over a puddle for Queen Elizabeth. It's a perfect tale of courtly romance and gentlemanly conduct. The problem is the entire cloak story is pure fiction. It was invented more than a century after Raleigh's death by a historian who clearly thought Raleigh's resume needed a bit more flair. As for tobacco, he didn't introduce it to England. It was already there. He was just a very effective and well-connected early adopter who helped make smoking fashionable among the aristocracy. So he was less of a trailblazing explorer and more of a 16th century celebrity influencer who got a great story made up about him. 29. It's one of the most powerful speeches in history, the Gettysburg Address. The legend claims a humble Abraham Lincoln, scribbling on the back of an envelope during the train ride to the event, spontaneously crafted this masterpiece. This paints him as a natural orator, channeling poetic genius on the fly. It's a lovely sentiment, but it's pure fiction. Lincoln was a meticulous writer who understood the gravity of the occasion. He spent weeks carefully drafting and revising the speech, crafting every word for maximum impact. The story of the envelope diminishes the immense effort and intellectual labor he invested. History just prefers the myth of effortless brilliance over the reality of hard work. 30. Marie Curie is often portrayed as a kind of scientific saint. A stoic, one-dimensional figure wholly dedicated to her research immune to the messiness of human life. This pristine image conveniently erases the woman behind the lab coat. After her husband's death, Curie had a passionate affair with a married colleague. When the affair became public, the French press, driven by a toxic mix of sexism and xenophobia, launched a vicious campaign to destroy her. Right as she was about to accept her second Nobel Prize, she was being publicly shamed and called a home-wrecking foreign temptress. It's a stark reminder that one of history's greatest scientific minds had to fight not just radiation, but also a public that was more interested in her love life than her genius. 31. Call someone Machiavellian, and you're calling them a conniving, backstabbing monster who believes the ends justify any means. Niccolò Machiavelli's name has become a synonym for pure political evil, thanks to his infamous book, The Prince. But this turns a complex political analyst into a cartoon villain. The Prince was not a guide on how to be a good person. It was a brutally pragmatic instruction manual for a ruler on how to gain and maintain power in the savage political landscape of Renaissance Italy. He wasn't advocating for this behavior as a moral ideal. He was simply describing what worked. It was less of a personal philosophy and more of a desperate job application, a dark mirror held up to the ugly face of power. 32. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks are filled with his famous mirror writing, scripted from right to left. The popular myth paints this as a cloak and dagger move, a brilliant code to protect his revolutionary ideas from the prying eyes of the church or lesser rivals. It transforms him into a Dan Brown protagonist. The real reason is far more practical and profoundly less exciting. Leonardo was left-handed. In an age of quill pens and wet ink, writing from left to right as a lefty means dragging your hand through everything you've just written, creating a smudged mess. Writing in reverse was simply a clean, practical solution. It wasn't a secret code, it was the ultimate 15th century life hack. 33. The story is as American as apple pie. Betsy Ross, a humble Philadelphia seamstress, stitches the first stars and stripes at the personal request of George Washington. It's a touching scene of patriotic craftwork. It's also a piece of historical fan fiction. There is not a single shred of contemporary evidence. No letters, no government records, no diary entries to support this tale. The entire story was cooked up by her grandson nearly a century later in a successful bid to turn his grandmother into a national hero. He had no proof, but it was a great story that America wanted to believe. So, one of the nation's founding symbols was born not from a historic meeting, but from a very effective family PR campaign. 34. King Canute the Great sits on his throne by the shore, commanding the incoming tide to halt. The waves, of course, ignore him, soaking the foolish king and teaching a lesson about the limits of earthly power. This story is always told to portray Canute as an arrogant fool who genuinely believed he could control nature. But that's the exact opposite of what actually happened. Canute was a wise and powerful ruler who was sick of his sycophantic courtiers telling him he was omnipotent. He staged the entire event to demonstrate to them that his power was nothing compared to the power of God. It wasn't an act of hubris. It was a brilliantly theatrical lesson in humility for his delusional yes-men. 35. Who invented the telephone? Every schoolchild knows the answer: Alexander Graham Bell. But the history of the telephone is less a story of a single genius and more a chaotic scramble to the patent office. An Italian inventor named Antonio Meucci had a working talking telegraph years before Bell, but was too poor to maintain his patent. Another inventor, Elisha Gray, filed a patent caveat for a similar device on the very same day as Bell. Bell, a shrewd businessman with better funding and more aggressive lawyers, simply outmaneuvered everyone. He didn't necessarily have the first idea, but he had the first officially recognized piece of paper, which in the world of innovation is often the only thing that matters. 36. On a windy day in 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright achieved the impossible, conquering the skies at Kitty Hawk. They became instant American heroes, celebrated from coast to coast, right? Not even close. The reality is that America completely ignored them. Their claims were met with a collective shrug and widespread disbelief from the press and the US government, who dismissed them as a pair of crackpot bicycle mechanics. It wasn't until they took their flying machine to France that they were finally celebrated as the geniuses they were. The French went wild, and only then, embarrassed by the international acclaim, did their home country finally catch on. They weren't just pioneers of aviation. They were pioneers of being famously ignored in their own backyard. 37. Joan of Arc, the teenage warrior saint, is almost always depicted as a battlefield commander in shining armor, sword in hand, leading the French army into the fray. It's an image of pure military prowess. But this simplifies her role into something she wasn't. Joan was not a trained general or a frontline soldier. Her true power was as a spiritual figurehead, a living symbol of divine will who skyrocketed morale. She rode with the army carrying her banner, not a sword, serving as an inspiration, not a strategist. To call her a general is to miss the point. She was a far more potent and unusual weapon, a prophet who convinced a demoralized army it couldn't lose. 38. Here's a story served up in restaurants everywhere. The great explorer Marco Polo journeyed to China and returned to Italy with the revolutionary discovery of pasta. It's a neat little bow on culinary history, linking East and West. It's also complete nonsense. Forms of pasta and noodles had been a staple in Italy and the Mediterranean world for centuries before Marco Polo was even born. The idea that one man single-handedly introduced a nation's signature dish is a marketing myth, likely popularized in the 20th century to make pasta seem more exotic and interesting. He saw noodles in China, yes, but bringing them to Italy was like bringing sand to a beach. 39. Vlad the Impaler. Thanks to Bram Stoker, his name is forever linked to the most famous vampire of all time, Dracula. The myth implies that the historical Vlad was, in fact, the blood-sucking monster of legend. But Stoker, an Irish author writing a horror novel in his library 4 centuries later, simply cherry-picked a terrifying historical figure from a land he'd never visited. He needed a cool, menacing name for his vampire, and Dracula, derived from Vlad's father's title, Dracul, sounded perfect. The historical Vlad was a brutal but complex ruler of Wallachia, whose preferred method of execution was horrifyingly real, not supernatural. He was a monster of history, not fiction. 40. And finally, the biggest of them all, King Arthur. The noble king who pulled Excalibur from the stone, founded Camelot, and led the Knights of the Round Table. He is the bedrock of British mythology. The most profound lie about King Arthur is the idea that he was a real, historical king in the first place. There is zero archaeological evidence and only a few fleeting, contradictory mentions in obscure early medieval texts of a possible Romano-British war leader who may have fought the Saxons. Everything else, the sword, the chivalry, Lancelot, the Holy Grail, was bolted on by poets and storytellers hundreds of years later. He isn't a historical figure whose story has been exaggerated. He is a literary invention with a historical ghost. So there you have it, 40 historical pedestals kicked over. But here's a dangerous question. Are some of these lies actually better than the truth? Does the myth of an honest Washington do more good than the reality? Tell me in the comments which lie you think we should secretly agree to keep telling, and why. I'm ready for some truly controversial answers. While you're at it, prove the algorithm isn't a lie by hitting like and subscribe.